Parents, when did you realize your child was protecting you from the truth? When my 11-year-old daughter collapsed during her school play and they found baby formula all over her costume. When she finally woke up in the nurse's office, her first question was, "Did I ruin it? Did I ruin her night?" I was convinced she was delirious from the fall. Look at this. The nurse held up my daughter's backpack and baby supplies tumbled out onto the counter. Formula, diapers, pacifiers. Why is your 11-year-old carrying infant supplies? My head spun with confusion. "I helped my stepmom," my daughter whispered in a monotonous voice. "Stepmom loves me. I need to text stepmom. She'll worry if I don't check in." "Check in?" The doctor raised an eyebrow. "It's 8 p.m. I have to check in every 2 hours to make sure everything's okay." She recited it like a rule. I felt cold. "Everything's okay with what?" She went quiet, with the same nervous look she got when my wife corrected her at dinner. Before anyone could press further, my daughter's phone buzzed. She lunged for it, but I got there first. 27 unread messages, I said slowly. In the last hour. My daughter's breathing quickened. "I need to answer. She needs to know." "Know what?" "Honey, I need you to unlock this phone for me." She refused. I wanted to push harder, but I could tell she was already on the brink of a panic attack. The principal appeared in the doorway, carrying my daughter's things. "Mr. Chen, I think you need to see what we found in her locker." Notebooks tumbled out, but they weren't school notebooks. They were filled with schedules written in purple crayon. "What's this?" I held up a page covered in timings. "Nothing! Fuck off, Daddy! Please leave me alone!" My daughter, the same girl who reminded me to put on my seatbelt, was now dropping the F-bomb. Something was very, very wrong. The doctor wrapped his fingers around her wrist with his eyebrows furrowed. "When was the last time you ate a full meal?" "I eat enough. Stepmom feeds me. Stepmom loves me." The same monotonous voice from before. "She's lost weight," the doctor said quietly. "Significant weight." "I've been busy," she mumbled. "Busy with what?" But she wouldn't look at me. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my wife. "Is everything handled for tonight?" I showed the text to my daughter, asking if she knew what it meant. Her face went white. "I didn't mean to fall," she said urgently. "I can still do it. I'm fine, I promise. I'm sorry." I blinked back the tears in my eyes, doing my best to stay strong for her. "Do what, honey?" She clamped her mouth shut, but her eyes kept darting to the door like she needed to be somewhere. Her phone buzzed again. And again. The messages kept coming, each notification making her flinch harder. "Please," she begged, reaching for it. "If I don't answer, she'll—" She stopped herself. "She'll what?" I asked gently. The doctor intervened. "Mr. Chen, has your daughter been caring for other children?" "No, of course not. She's 11. But my daughter's face told a different story. She was rocking slightly, the same motion I'd seen her do with her old baby doll. "Sweetie," I tried again. "What happens at night? After I go to bed?" My daughter made a sound like a wounded animal. "I need to go home. Right now. Please. You're in the hospital." "They're alone!" The words ripped out of her before she could stop them. Then, quieter, defeated. "They're alone, and they're too little. And I promised." The room went silent after her outburst. My daughter's face crumpled as she realized what she'd said. "I mean, the fish. Her goldfish. They need their dinner." The lie hung in the air like smoke. "Sweetheart," the doctor said gently, "are there children at home right now? Without an adult?" She started that rocking motion again, harder this time. Her phone lit up with another message. 1 hour. That's all you had to last. "Who's texting you?" I tried to grab the phone, but she clutched it. "Nobody. It's my friend Polly." My hands were shaking as I called Mrs. Patterson next door. She answered on the first ring. "Thank God you called," she said immediately. "Why? Are there unattended kids at my house right now?" "Yes, your daughter usually handles dinner by now. She's very responsible." "My daughter? Such a mature young lady. When I was her age at 15 years old, I barely knew how to pour a bowl of cereal, let alone cook, clean, and babysit 3 kids. My throat closed up. "Mrs. Patterson, my daughter is 11. Dead silence. "The girl dragging garbage bags to the curb is 11? "Yes." Even the doctor's face went dark. "I have some videos you need to see," Mrs. Patterson said. 3 months of proof. I'm coming now." The emergency room doors burst open, and Mrs. Patterson rushed in holding her phone and a USB drive, her face white as a sheet. She grabbed the nurse's arm and shoved the USB at her while catching her breath. The nurse looked confused, but Mrs. Patterson kept pushing it toward the computer on the desk. My daughter's eyes went wide when she saw our neighbor, and she tried to slide off the bed, but the doctor held her shoulder. Mrs. Patterson kept saying she had 3 months of videos that we needed to see right now. The nurse finally plugged in the USB and clicked on the first file. The computer screen filled with grainy night vision footage from what looked like Mrs. Patterson's doorbell camera. There was my daughter dragging 2 huge trash bags toward the curb, while a baby wailed in her other arm. The timestamp showed 11:07 p.m. last Tuesday. I felt my stomach drop because I remembered being asleep in bed at that exact time. My daughter was supposed to be asleep too, but here she was outside in her pajamas struggling with garbage and an infant. The baby in the video kept crying, and my daughter was bouncing it while trying to drag the bags with one hand. She looked so small next to those giant bags. The nurse clicked the next video dated from 2 weeks ago. My daughter was walking back and forth on our driveway at midnight with what looked like twin babies in her arms. She was doing that swaying motion parents do to calm crying kids. Another video showed her carrying formula and diapers from our garage at 2 a.m. Mrs. Patterson had dozens of these files, all showing my daughter outside at night when I thought she was sleeping. The emergency room got quiet except for the computer speakers playing baby cries from the videos. A man in a suit walked through the emergency room doors and introduced himself as Jeffrey Frost from Child Protective Services. He said the hospital called about a potential emergency situation involving minors. The doctor showed him the videos still playing on the computer, and Jeffrey's face got serious fast. He pulled out his phone and made a call asking for an immediate welfare check at our address. My daughter heard him say welfare check and started breathing too fast. She grabbed at his sleeve, begging him to let her call my wife first. She kept saying she needed to warn her or something bad would happen to them. Jeffrey asked who them meant, but my daughter just shook her head and kept begging to use the phone. Her whole body was shaking now, and the heart monitor started beeping faster. The doctor stepped between them and put his hand on my daughter's wrist to check her pulse. He told Jeffrey that my daughter was showing clear signs of trauma bonding and something called coercive control. He ordered the nurse to run more tests while Jeffrey started typing notes on his tablet about an emergency removal petition. My daughter kept trying to get off the bed, but her legs were too weak. Jeffrey's phone rang and he put it on speaker. 2 police officers were calling from our house saying they found something we needed to know about immediately. They discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in our basement with 3 toddlers inside. The oldest one, who looked about 2 years old, kept crying for someone called Sissy. There were twin infants in cribs that needed immediate diaper changes and formula. The officers said the room had a small ventilation system but no windows, and only one way in or out through the hidden door. My daughter made a terrible sound when she heard the officers describe the room. She curled into a ball on the hospital bed and started that rocking motion harder than before. Jeffrey made another call, and within 20 minutes, a woman named Madison Frost arrived. She introduced herself as Jeffrey's supervisor and said she was coordinating emergency placement for the 3 toddlers. She explained they would go to Helen Gutierrez, who was their most experienced emergency foster parent. The kids needed immediate medical evaluation, and Helen was already on her way to pick them up from the hospital once the officers brought them in. My daughter kept asking if the babies were okay and if they were scared without her. I tried calling my wife, but she didn't answer the first 4 times. When she finally picked up, I put it on speaker so Jeffrey could hear. She said she was at her night shift at the hospital in the calmest voice, like nothing was wrong. Jeffrey typed something on his phone and then showed me the screen. He had called the hospital and my wife wasn't on tonight's schedule. She hadn't been scheduled for a night shift in 6 months, according to their records. My wife kept talking about how busy the emergency department was tonight, but Jeffrey was shaking his head. He asked her which department she was in and she said pediatrics, but the hospital confirmed no one by her name was working anywhere in the building tonight. The IT specialist from the hospital came in with equipment to extract data from my daughter's phone. My daughter didn't want to give them the password, but the doctor explained they needed to understand what was happening to keep everyone safe. She finally unlocked it with shaking fingers. The specialist found a timer app that was set to buzz every 2 hours starting at 8 p.m. and ending at 6 a.m. every single night. The message history showed hundreds of texts from my wife with threats about what would happen if my daughter didn't respond within 5 minutes of each timer. One message said the babies would go hungry if she was late. Another said they would be taken away forever if anyone found out. There were photos my daughter had to send showing the babies were fed and changed with timestamps proving she did it on schedule. Mrs. Patterson pulled up more doorbell footage on her phone showing my wife leaving our house every night around 8:30 p.m. She would get in her car and drive away, then return after 2 a.m. The pattern went back 3 months on the footage. Mrs. Patterson said she assumed my wife worked night shifts at the hospital because that's what she told everyone in the neighborhood. But now looking at all the videos together, it was clear my wife was going somewhere else entirely, while my 11-year-old daughter took care of 3 hidden toddlers alone in our basement every single night. My daughter finally started shaking and pointed at the purple crayon pages scattered on the hospital bed. She grabbed one and traced her finger along the times she'd written down. The first baby needed formula at 8:30 p.m. and again at 10:30 p.m. The twins had different schedules because one had reflux and needed smaller feeds every hour. She knew which lullabies worked for each baby when they wouldn't stop crying. She'd memorized that the oldest liked being rocked side to side, but the twins needed up and down bouncing. Her voice got quieter as she explained how she'd figured out the exact water temperature for their bottles. She showed me notes about which diapers fit which baby and how to prevent diaper rash with the cream my wife kept locked in the cabinet. Jeffrey was typing everything into his tablet while listening to her. He stepped out into the hallway and made several phone calls I couldn't hear. Through the window, I saw him pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. The hospital social worker came in and told me Jeffrey was filing emergency paperwork right now. I walked down to the hospital chapel because I couldn't stand being in that room anymore. The chapel was empty except for a security guard sitting in the back row. He brought me a cup of coffee from the vending machine and sat down next to me. He said he'd worked hospital security for 15 years and seen parents find out terrible things about their families. He told me the hardest part was when one parent had no idea what the other was doing. I just stared at the cross on the wall trying to understand how I'd missed all of this. The pediatrician came to find me and said she needed to do a special assessment on my daughter. We went back to the room where she was checking my daughter's reflexes and responses. Every time someone's phone buzzed or beeped, my daughter would jump and look around frantically. The pediatrician wrote notes about something she called hypervigilance. She asked my daughter to follow a light with her eyes, but she kept zoning out and staring at nothing. The pediatrician explained this was dissociation from trauma. My phone rang and it was Madison calling with an update about the toddlers. She said Helen had picked them up and taken them straight to her pediatrician. The twins both had severe diaper rash that looked infected. The oldest one wasn't talking much and seemed delayed for a 2-year-old. Helen found they were all underweight and the twins were dehydrated. Madison said Helen was experienced with neglected children and would get them proper care immediately. About an hour later, my wife showed up at the hospital with a man in a suit. She was acting calm and saying this was all a big misunderstanding about babysitting. The man introduced himself as her attorney and said they wanted to clear everything up. Jeffrey walked over with papers in his hand and gave them to my wife. He told her it was an emergency removal order and notice of investigation. Her face went white when she read the papers. Her lawyer started arguing about procedure, but Jeffrey just kept handing them more documents. The school counselor arrived carrying a folder of my daughter's recent work. She spread out drawings my daughter had made during art class. There were tiny stick figures labeled Baby 1 and Baby 2 and Baby 3 in purple crayon. The counselor said teachers noticed my daughter falling asleep at her desk almost every day. They thought maybe she was staying up late playing video games. Nobody knew she was taking care of 3 toddlers all night long. The hospital social worker introduced me to a lawyer named Theo Wallace. He sat down and looked through all the evidence Jeffrey had collected so far. He pulled out his laptop and started typing up emergency paperwork for a protective order. He said we needed to keep my wife away from our daughter immediately. The judge could make it permanent later, but we needed protection right now. He filed everything electronically and got a response within 2 hours. My daughter kept asking if the babies were okay every few minutes. She wanted to know if they were scared or hungry or crying for her. A woman named Berenice Yang came to evaluate her mental state. She explained that kids forced to be caregivers often worry more about others than themselves. My daughter couldn't stop thinking about whether the babies had their special blankets. The police detective arrived with special recording equipment for interviewing child victims. He explained they had to follow specific protocols to protect my daughter and make sure her statement would hold up in court. My daughter was scared to talk at first, but the detective was patient and gentle. She finally told him my wife said she would hurt the babies if anyone found out about them. That's why she kept it secret even when she collapsed at the school and knew she needed help. She said my wife told her the babies would disappear forever if she told anyone. The detective asked if she knew where the babies came from or who their parents were. My daughter shook her head and said they just showed up one day 3 months ago. Jeffrey had been researching the toddlers all day but couldn't find anything about them. There were no birth certificates in any state database, no medical records at any hospital or clinic, no vaccination records or pediatrician visits anywhere. These 3 kids didn't exist on paper at all. Jeffrey said this was turning into something much bigger than just child endangerment. Theo handed me a stack of papers showing my wife's bank statements with deposits of $500 coming in every single week from accounts we couldn't trace. He pointed at the dates and said these payments matched up with when the babies first showed up at our house. My wife kept texting that it was just babysitting money, but nobody pays that much for regular childcare. The detective took photos of every page while Jeffrey made calls to trace where the money came from. My daughter was getting discharged, but we couldn't go home since it was still a crime scene. The motel on Riverside Drive had rooms available, and the manager gave us one at the far end when he heard what happened. My daughter crashed hard on the bed and slept 6 straight hours without waking up once to check on anybody. I sat in the chair watching her breathe normally for the first time in months. My phone buzzed with photos from Helen showing the toddlers eating dinner at her kitchen table. The oldest boy kept looking around and asking where Sissy was because she always fed him. Helen said he wouldn't eat unless she promised Sissy was coming back soon. The twins were doing better, but still had bad diaper rash from not being changed enough. Berenice showed up the next morning for my daughter's first therapy session right there in the motel room. She brought a bag of toy babies and cribs and watched my daughter arrange them over and over. My daughter spent the whole hour making sure each baby was perfectly positioned and had the right blanket. She kept checking them in the same order she used to check the real babies at home. Berenice wrote notes about the compulsive behavior and how my daughter couldn't stop even when asked to take a break. The principal called while they were working and said teachers would bring schoolwork to the motel. She didn't want my daughter falling behind more than she already had from exhaustion. The teachers had made a schedule to take turns visiting and helping her catch up on assignments. Jeffrey called with more news about my wife's storage unit across town. The place was packed with formula and diapers bought in bulk going back 8 months. The receipts showed she'd been planning this way before Mrs. Patterson started recording 3 months ago. There were cribs and baby clothes for different ages like she expected to keep getting more kids. My wife's sister Laura called me crying and swearing she had no idea about any of this. She said my wife had been asking to borrow money for the last few months. My wife told her we were having money troubles, but I never knew about any of that. Laura offered to help with anything we needed and kept apologizing even though it wasn't her fault. The hospital bills showed up at my work address since I couldn't get mail at the motel. Insurance covered most of the emergency room visit, but the ongoing therapy would add up fast. I had to figure out a new budget without my wife's regular income to help with expenses. That night, my daughter woke up screaming that the babies were hungry and needed their bottles. She was shaking and crying that they'd starve if she didn't feed them right now. I held her tight and called Helen so she could hear the toddlers were safe. Helen put the phone on speaker so my daughter could hear them playing in the background. The oldest one was laughing at something on TV and the twins were babbling happily. My daughter slowly calmed down hearing they were okay, but she still worried about their schedule. Helen promised they were eating 3 meals a day plus snacks and getting plenty of attention. Judge Barnes's office called to schedule an emergency hearing for the following week. Theo started preparing me for what would happen and warned me my wife would probably act like this was all a misunderstanding. He said she'd try to make it seem like normal babysitting that got out of hand. We had to be ready with all the evidence to show the pattern of abuse and control. The detective had statements from neighbors and teachers, plus all the medical records. Jeffrey's report alone was damaging enough with everything he'd found so far. But Theo said my wife would have her own lawyer trying to poke holes in everything. The hearing would determine temporary custody and whether the protective order would become permanent. My daughter would have to testify, but they'd let her do it over video from another room. Theo filed paperwork requesting sole custody with supervised visits only if the judge allowed any contact. He didn't think my wife should see our daughter at all until after criminal proceedings were done. The criminal charges were still being investigated, but would probably include child endangerment at minimum. If they could prove the money trail led to trafficking, my wife would face federal charges too. For now, we just had to get through each day at the motel and help my daughter heal. She still flinched every time a phone buzzed and kept asking if the babies needed anything. Berenice said it would take months or maybe years for her to stop feeling responsible for them. The compulsive checking might never fully go away, but would hopefully become manageable with therapy. Helen sent updates every day with photos, so my daughter could see the toddlers were thriving. The oldest had started talking more and even said a few new words he'd never used before. The twins were gaining weight, and their skin was clearing up from proper care and nutrition. Jeffrey called me the next morning with news that made my stomach drop. The DNA tests on the 3 toddlers came back showing none of them were related to each other or to us. He explained that this pattern usually meant one thing, and he'd already contacted the FBI about possible trafficking. 2 agents showed up at the motel that afternoon with badges and serious faces. They asked me questions about my wife's schedule and any strange people she might have mentioned. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much since she'd hidden this whole thing so well. My daughter sat at the small motel table picking at a sandwich while the agents talked to me. She took tiny bites and wrapped half of it in a napkin when she thought I wasn't looking. Later, I found crackers and granola bars stuffed in her jacket pockets. The doctor at our follow-up appointment explained this was normal for kids who'd been food deprived. She didn't know when her next meal would come for, so long that her body still thought she needed to save food. He said it could take months for her to feel safe enough to stop hoarding. Mrs. Patterson knocked on our motel door that evening with a casserole dish and 3 grocery bags. Behind her stood 4 other neighbors I barely knew carrying more food and supplies. She started crying and apologizing for not calling someone sooner about what she'd seen. I told her she saved my daughter's life by recording those videos and coming to the hospital. Without her evidence, we might never have known what was happening. The neighbors set up a meal schedule so we'd have dinner delivered every night for the next month. One woman brought her daughter's old clothes that might fit mine since we'd left the house with almost nothing. The motel manager let them use the breakfast room as a drop-off spot for everything. My phone rang at 2 in the morning with news that made me see red. My wife had posted bail using money from her parents and immediately drove past our motel. The manager had seen her car circling the parking lot 3 times before he called the cops. They arrested her again right there in the lot with new charges for violating the protective order. Her lawyer tried to argue it was an accident, but the security footage showed her slowing down near our room. The judge revoked her bail completely this time. Berenice started teaching my daughter ways to handle the panic attacks that hit her randomly. They practiced something called box breathing, where she'd count to 4 while breathing in and out. Berenice gave her a small, smooth stone to rub when she felt scared. She also taught her to name 5 things she could see and 4 things she could touch. These tricks helped when my daughter woke up gasping about the babies needing bottles. Sometimes she'd use them during the day when a baby crying on TV sent her into a spiral. The principal called an emergency staff meeting after learning what happened to my daughter. She sent me the new protocols they were putting in place to catch signs of abuse earlier. Teachers would now report any child who seemed tired or unfocused consistently. The nurse would document weight changes more carefully. They created a system where different staff members could share concerns about students. The counselor would check in with kids who had sudden behavior changes. It felt like too little too late, but at least future kids might get help sooner. Jeffrey called with more evidence that made everything worse. He'd found emails where my wife responded to sketchy online ads offering cash for childcare. The posts used code words, but the FBI recognized them from other trafficking cases. They traced the IP addresses to a ring operating in 3 states. My wife had been getting $500 a week per kid. The FBI agent said she probably didn't know the full scope, but she definitely knew it was illegal. They found similar ads going back 8 months matching when she'd rented the storage unit. My daughter asked if she could write letters to the babies during her therapy session. She knew they couldn't read, but wanted to tell them she was sorry for not being there. Berenice thought this was a good way to process her guilt about leaving them. She helped my daughter write simple notes, saying she hoped they were happy and eating good food. We couldn't actually send them, but my daughter felt better after writing her feelings down. She drew pictures of bottles and toys to include with each letter. Helen sent photos of the toddlers with their foster siblings, and my daughter smiled seeing them play. My boss called after I'd been out for a week asking when I'd return. I explained the situation and requested family medical leave to focus on my daughter's recovery. He immediately approved it and connected me with the Employee Assistance Program for counseling resources. The company would cover 6 therapy sessions for me to process everything too. He said to take all the time I needed, and my job would be waiting. His own daughter was 11, and he couldn't imagine going through this. The emergency custody hearing date arrived faster than expected. Jeffrey spent the morning preparing his report with all the evidence organized in folders. He had the videos from Mrs. Patterson and the medical records from the hospital. The text messages showing the control pattern were printed and highlighted. Photos of the hidden room and the condition of the toddlers were included. My daughter's purple crayon schedules were in plastic sleeves. The judge would see everything we discovered in the past 2 weeks laid out clearly. The courthouse waiting room smelled like old coffee and floor wax when we arrived for the emergency hearing 3 days later. My daughter sat beside me picking at the sleeve of her new sweater while Jeffrey organized his folders at the table across from us. My wife walked in with her lawyer 20 minutes late, wearing a suit I'd never seen before and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The bailiff called us into the courtroom where Judge Barnes sat reviewing the thick stack of papers Jeffrey had submitted. My wife's lawyer stood up first and started talking about financial pressure and poor judgment while shuffling through his own papers. He kept using words like desperate and overwhelmed, trying to paint my wife as a victim of circumstances who just needed help with childcare expenses. Judge Barnes looked up from the documents and asked him directly if threatening an 11-year-old counted as poor judgment. The lawyer stammered something about misunderstandings before sitting back down. Jeffrey called Mrs. Patterson to testify first, and she walked to the stand carrying her phone with all the videos saved. She started crying when she described watching my daughter drag garbage bags to the curb at midnight with a baby strapped to her chest. The judge had to pause twice for her to compose herself as she explained how she thought my daughter was older because of how capable she seemed. She showed the court video after video of my daughter doing adult tasks while clearly exhausted. The timestamps proved this happened almost every night for months. Next, the doctor from the hospital took the stand with my daughter's medical charts. He explained how her body showed signs of severe sleep deprivation that would have eventually caused organ damage. Her weight loss was documented at 15 pounds in 3 months, which for a child her size was dangerous. He testified that the level of exhaustion he observed could only come from months of interrupted sleep and constant stress. The judge asked specific questions about the physical effects, and the doctor described how malnutrition and exhaustion at that level constitutes medical neglect. Judge Barnes reviewed all the evidence for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes. He looked at the purple crayon schedules, the text messages with their threatening tone, and the photos of the hidden room where the toddlers were kept. He asked my wife if she wanted to explain herself, but her lawyer advised her not to speak. The judge's face got darker with each piece of evidence he examined. Finally, he announced his decision, granting me temporary sole custody immediately. My wife would only get supervised visits once a week at a court facility, and she had to complete psychological evaluation and parenting classes before any changes could be considered. Her lawyer tried to argue for unsupervised visits, but the judge cut him off and said the evidence showed clear endangerment. My wife started crying, but the judge was already moving on to the next requirements. 2 weeks passed before I saw my daughter genuinely smile again. We were in our motel room eating takeout and watching cartoons when she suddenly laughed at something silly on the screen. It was just a small giggle, but after months of that blank stare, it felt huge. She looked surprised at herself, like she'd forgotten she could make that sound. These tiny moments kept happening, each one feeling like a victory. Jeffrey called the next morning with news that made everything even more real. The FBI had matched one of the toddlers to a missing child report from Arizona. The biological parents were flying in that afternoon, and Jeffrey wanted to prepare us for how emotional it might be. My daughter asked if she could see them reunite, but Berenice thought it might be too overwhelming for her. Instead, Jeffrey sent us a photo later of the parents holding their son, all 3 of them crying. The mother had written a note thanking whoever kept her baby safe, not knowing it was an 11-year-old girl. Helen called that evening to update us on the twins. They were gaining weight and starting to babble more, which the doctor said was a good sign. She'd already started the paperwork to become their permanent guardian if no biological family could be found. My daughter listened to the update quietly, then asked if they were eating enough. Helen assured her they were getting proper nutrition and medical care. The relief on my daughter's face was obvious. School became the next challenge when the principal called about modified scheduling. My daughter would start with just mornings, 3 days a week, with the option to leave if she felt overwhelmed. Her teachers had been briefed on the basics without all the details. The counselor would check on her daily, and she could take breaks whenever needed. The first day back, she lasted 2 hours before calling me to pick her up. The second day, she made it to lunch. By the third week, she was staying for full mornings and even talking to a few friends. Theo met with me while my daughter was at therapy to discuss the criminal case. The prosecutor was offering my wife a deal where she'd plead guilty to child endangerment and serve 2 years in prison. She'd also lose all parental rights permanently. If she refused and went to trial, she could face trafficking charges that carried 10 years minimum. Theo recommended taking the deal since it guaranteed she'd be away from my daughter and couldn't contest custody later. My wife's family started reaching out, but I wasn't ready to deal with them yet. Finding a new place became urgent when the motel manager mentioned they needed our room for regular bookings soon. I spent every evening searching for apartments in our school district so my daughter could keep some stability. Most places were too expensive on just my salary, but finally I found a 2-bedroom that was small but clean. Mrs. Patterson came with me to see it and immediately started making lists of what we'd need. She organized the whole neighborhood to donate furniture and household items. People I barely knew showed up with dishes, bedding, and even a TV for my daughter's room. Moving day felt like starting over in the best way possible. 3 weeks into therapy, Berenice had my daughter working with art supplies during their sessions. I waited outside in the hallway, scrolling through work emails while listening to the muffled sounds from inside. The door opened and Berenice motioned me in to see what my daughter had drawn. The paper showed stick figures, but this time the big one was colored in angry red scribbles. My daughter sat there ripping up another paper into tiny pieces, her hands shaking. Berenice explained this was actually good progress since my daughter was finally letting herself feel mad at my wife instead of just scared all the time. On the drive home, my daughter stared out the window and didn't say anything, but I noticed she wasn't checking her phone every 2 minutes anymore. Jeffrey called that afternoon with news about the twins. After weeks of searching, no biological family had been found for them, and Helen was starting the adoption paperwork to keep them together. My daughter listened when I told her, then went to her room and closed the door. I could hear her crying through the thin walls of our new apartment. The next morning, a package arrived from my wife's sister with a check for $2,000 and a note saying she was sorry about everything. More relatives started reaching out over the next few days, some offering money, others just expressing shock at what had happened. My wife's mother called crying, saying she couldn't believe her daughter had done this to a child. They all promised to stay in my daughter's life despite everything. 6 weeks had passed since that night at the hospital when I woke up at 3 in the morning to check on her. She was actually sleeping, not tossing and turning or waking up screaming like before. Her phone sat on the nightstand and she wasn't clutching it anymore. I stood there watching her breathe normally, looking peaceful for the first time in months. The school called about the spring play coming up in April. The director wanted to know if my daughter might help backstage since she'd been in the fall production before everything happened. I asked my daughter at dinner, and she pushed her food around her plate thinking about it. She finally nodded yes, but I could see her hands trembling. Jeffrey came by for his final home visit, carrying his thick folder of paperwork. He walked through our apartment, checked the locks on the windows, looked in the fridge to see we had food, and asked my daughter how school was going. She showed him her grades, which were slowly improving, and he marked something in his file. He said the case would officially close since she was safe and doing better, though he'd check in every few months just to make sure. My daughter surprised me by asking if we could visit the twins at Helen's house. I called Helen, who said we could come that Saturday afternoon. The drive there took 20 minutes, and my daughter kept fidgeting with her seatbelt the whole way. When we arrived, the twins were playing in the living room with blocks, looking healthy and clean. They didn't recognize my daughter at first, which seemed to hurt and relieve her at the same time. Helen showed us how much weight they'd gained and how they were starting to walk better. One of them handed my daughter a toy car, and she sat on the floor playing with them for a few minutes before saying she needed to go. We started building new routines that felt nothing like our old life. Friday nights, we'd get pizza and watch movies on the couch. Saturdays, we'd go to the park and feed the ducks. Sundays, we'd cook together, usually something simple like pancakes or grilled cheese. These small, normal things felt huge after everything we'd been through. Theo called one afternoon saying a letter had arrived from my wife in prison. He'd read it first like we'd agreed, and his voice sounded tired when he said we shouldn't show it to my daughter. The letter was apparently full of excuses and blame, saying I'd never understood her struggles and that my daughter was being dramatic about everything. Theo said he'd keep it in the file in case we ever needed it for legal reasons, but there was no point letting my daughter see it now, or maybe ever. The spring play rehearsals started, and my daughter went 3 times a week to help with props and costumes. I'd drop her off and watch her walk inside, shoulders tense but determined. The drama teacher said she was doing well, mostly keeping to herself but getting the work done. Other kids were starting to include her in conversations about the show. Opening night arrived in late April, and I sat in the audience watching the stage. My daughter was invisible backstage, but I knew she was there making sure props were in the right places and costumes were ready. During intermission, I caught a glimpse of her in the wings laughing at something another kid said. The show ended and the cast took their bows while the crew came out for recognition. My daughter stood with the other backstage kids, wearing all black, looking nervous but proud. She waved when she saw me in the audience, a real smile on her face. After the show, she introduced me to a couple of kids from the crew who seemed nice and normal. We went out for ice cream with them and their parents, and I watched my daughter act like a regular 11-year-old for the first time in so long. She was talking about the funny things that happened backstage and complaining about homework like any other kid would. The next week, Berenice Yang sat across from us in her office and flipped through her notes while my daughter played with a stress ball in her hands. She said my daughter was making great progress and suggested we could reduce sessions to twice a month instead of weekly. My daughter nodded and kept squeezing the ball, but I could see her shoulders relax a little. We scheduled the next appointments and walked out to the car where my daughter asked if we could stop for tacos on the way home. 2 weeks later, Helen called to say the twins' adoption was final and she wanted us to come to a small celebration that weekend. My daughter spent Friday afternoon at the toy store picking out stuffed animals for each twin. She chose a blue elephant and a yellow giraffe and had them wrapped in special paper. At Helen's house on Saturday, the twins were crawling around the living room looking healthy and chubby. My daughter handed them the stuffed animals and sat on the floor while they grabbed at the toys. Helen took pictures and served cake while other guests talked about how far the twins had come. My daughter stayed near the twins but didn't try to feed them or change them like she would have before. The following Monday, a letter arrived addressed to my daughter with a return address from another state. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the biological parents thanking her for keeping their baby safe during those terrible months. We sat on the couch and I read it out loud while my daughter listened. Tears rolled down her face, but she was smiling too. She asked if we could frame the letter and put it in her room. That Thursday, the art teacher stopped me during pickup to say my daughter had joined the art club. She was working on a painting project with 3 other girls who didn't know anything about what happened. They just liked her drawings and wanted her in their group. My daughter came out carrying a canvas covered in paint splatters and talking about mixing colors. The next Saturday, we were at the grocery store buying milk when my wife's sister turned the corner with her cart. She froze for a second, then walked over slowly. She bent down and hugged my daughter gently without saying much. My daughter hugged her back, and they stayed like that for a few seconds. Her sister squeezed my shoulder and said she'd been thinking about us before walking away with tears in her eyes. That night, my daughter asked if we could get a pet. She said she wanted something to take care of, but only if she wanted to. We went to the animal shelter the next day and looked at all the cats. An older orange cat named Chester rubbed against the cage when my daughter put her finger through. The shelter worker said Chester was 8 years old and very calm. We brought him home in a carrier and set up his bed in my daughter's room. Chester seemed to understand my daughter needed quiet company and would sit next to her while she did homework. 6 months passed and Helen called to invite us to the twins' first birthday party. We drove to her house on a sunny afternoon with presents my daughter had picked out. The backyard was decorated with balloons and other families were there with their kids. My daughter helped carry plates to the table and handed out napkins like any party guest would. She sang happy birthday with everyone else and watched the twins smash their hands into the cake. Helen's older kids played games in the yard and my daughter joined them for freeze tag. When summer started, I signed my daughter up for day camp at the community center. The first morning, she packed her backpack with a water bottle and sunscreen. She ran ahead to join a group of kids waiting by the camp banner. They were all talking about swimming lessons and arts and crafts. I watched her backpack bounce as she walked with them toward the activities building. No baby supplies weighing it down anymore. Just normal kid stuff like every other 11-year-old carrying. I stood there in the parking lot for a minute, breathing deep. The breath I'd been holding since that night at the hospital finally came out all the way. Well, that was definitely a journey to share with you all. Kinda makes you look at things a little differently, right? Thanks for sticking around with me. Like the video? It helps more than you think.